The town was founded in 1607. In 1676, it burned to the ground in Bacon's Rebellion. During the colonial era, the British ruled over the colonies loosely in a situation known as salutary neglect. However, salutary neglect would end after the 1754 to 1763 French and Indian War. Then came all of those causes of the American Revolution: the Proclamation of 1763, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, and ultimately the beginning of the Revolutionary War. In 1776, you get common sense as well as the Declaration of Independence. The following year was the war's turning point at Saratoga. In 1781, the decisive battle at Yorktown. In 1783, you get the Treaty of Paris that ends the Revolution. Note, from 1781 to 1789, the Articles of Confederation were the law of the land during a time period known as the Critical Period. After Shays' rebellion proved that the Articles were weak, in 1787 you get the Constitutional Convention. In 1789 the Constitution goes into effect. Note that the Bill of Rights came a little later in 1791. During the New Republic you get the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. That proved that the Constitution was strong. In 1794 as well you have the Jay Treaty. That leads to the 1797 XYZ affair, as the French were rather upset. Next came the Alien and Sedition Acts, and ultimately the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800 in what was known as the Revolution of 1800. In 1803 you have the Louisiana Purchase. In 1807 the very unpopular Embargo Act. The War of 1812 was from 1812 to 1815. In 1815 you have the Battle of New Orleans, which made Andrew Jackson a hero. In 1820 you have the first of 3 slave compromises with the Missouri Compromise, 3630. In 1823 it's the Monroe Doctrine. Andrew Jackson was elected in 1828. That same year you get the Tariff of Abominations. That led to John C. Calhoun's South Carolina Exposition and Protest, where he demanded states' rights. In 1832, South Carolina issues the Ordinance of Nullification. However, secession never happens because of an 1833 compromise tariff. Regarding another economic concern, President Andrew Jackson vetoed the rechartering of the Bank of the United States in 1832. This led to the formation of the Whig Party. Also during the age of Jackson, you have the 1830 Indian Removal Act. In 1836, you have the Alamo. From 1846 to 1848, it's the Mexican-American War. Also in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. Note that from roughly 1845 to 1860, it's the first great wave of immigration, or old immigration, where the immigrants are coming mostly from Western Europe, from places such as Ireland. The second Manifest Destiny Compromise was the Compromise of 1850, in 1850. And the final one was in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Also in 1854, you have the founding of the Republican Party. 1857 was the Dred Scott case, 1859 was John Brown's raid, and ultimately in 1860, you have the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession of the South. From 1861 to 1865, it's the Civil War. Note that in 1863, you have the Emancipation Proclamation taking effect. 1865 to 1877 was Reconstruction. Note that in 1867, you have Radical Reconstruction taking effect with the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. The year Reconstruction ends in 1877, you also have the Great Railroad Strike. During the Gilded Age, it's the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and in 1887 you have the Dawes Act, which tried to assimilate Native Americans. In 1890 you have the tragedy of Wounded Knee. Also that same year of 1890, it's the Sherman Antitrust Act, Restraint of Trade. From 1892 to 1896, it's Populism. 1892 is the Omaha Platform, and in 1896, William Jennings Bryan loses the election after the Cross of Gold speech. That same year, in 1896, it's Plessy versus Ferguson. At the end of the Gilded Age, you have the new immigration, or the second great wave. Most of these immigrants came from Eastern and Southern Europe, from places such as Italy or Russia. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt becomes president during the Progressive Era. In 1902, you have the Anthracite Coal Strike. In 1906, Upton Sinclair writes The Jungle, which leads to the FDA and the Meat Inspection Act. 1907 is the Gentleman's Agreement. Around the same time, you have the Age of Imperialism. It begins in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. Also, you have the 1899 Open Door Policy, 1904 Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and ultimately, from 1917 to 1918, the United States is involved in World War I. However, the American Senate never does ratify the Treaty of Versailles. In 1924, you need to know about the National Origins Act, which created quotas for immigrants. 1925 is the Scopes trial. In 1929, the stock market crashed. That led to the New Deal, which began in 1933 with the 100 Days. In 1935, it's the Second New Deal, with Social Security as well as the Wagner Act. 1941 was the beginning of World War II for America with Pearl Harbor. In 1945 is the end of the war and the dropping of the atomic bomb. Before that, in 1944, was the important court case of Korematsu versus the United States that involved Japanese internment. From 1945 to 1991, it's the Cold War. 1947 is the Truman Doctrine as well as the Marshall Plan. 1948 is the Berlin Airlift. From 1950 to 1953, it's the Korean War. 1954 is Brown versus the Board of Education. That overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. That same year, Dien Bien Phu fell to communists in North Vietnam. In 1964, the United States escalates the war in Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. That same year is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 1968 is the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. 1970 was the tragic protest of the Vietnam War at Kent State. In 1973, President Nixon announces a ceasefire ending the war in Vietnam. The following year, in 1974, Nixon resigns after Watergate. 1978 was the Camp David Accords, and in 1979 you have the Iran hostage crisis. That doesn't end until 1981, the same year that Ronald Reagan is inaugurated. Once again, for details on all of these events, please subscribe to this channel, and you can get history review videos. For more review, you can get free flashcards and review sheets at MrClap.com. We also invite you to check out Noble Review in both paperback and ebook formats. Best of luck on your tests.